Most people learn the story of America's founding as a tale of revolution, high ideals, soaring speeches, and the heroic pursuit of liberty. But if you peel back the patriotic paint, if you trace the story not through the slogans, but through the ledgers, bonds, loans, and quiet transactions that shaped every decision, you'll find a far more revealing picture. The truth is simple, uncomfortable, and rarely taught. The United States didn't just fight its way into existence. It was financed into existence. The revolution wasn't only a clash of philosophies. It was a collision of economic incentives, imperial interests, collapsing financial systems, and foreign bankers who saw the colonies not as a nation struggling for freedom, but as an asset waiting to be leveraged. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and where the real story of America begins not with a declaration, but with a debt. To understand how the United States emerged, you have to go back decades before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, back to a global economy stretched thin by the 7 Years' War, a conflict so devastating and expensive that it drained the British Treasury, ballooned national debt, and forced Parliament to stare down a financial crisis it could no longer ignore. Britain had won the war, but victory came with a frightening bill: soaring interest payments, fragile credit, a volatile bond market, and a political class scrambling to stabilize a fiscal system on the brink. And in London's eyes, the solution was obvious. If the empire was expensive to defend, then the colonies benefiting from that defense should pay. New taxes weren't designed as oppression. They were designed as revenue. The Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend duties, these weren't ideological weapons. They were accounting strategies meant to patch a hemorrhaging balance sheet. But the colonists experienced these measures very differently. They saw taxes imposed without representation, economic rules designed to enrich British merchants at colonial expense, and most importantly, a financial system engineered to keep the colonies dependent, indebted, and subordinate. Britain treated the colonies as assets. The colonies felt like captives. At the center of this tension was mercantilism, the economic framework that bound the colonies to Britain like spokes to a wheel. Under mercantilism, the colonies were not partners, they were instruments. They produced raw materials, bought British goods, shipped them on British vessels, and funneled wealth back to the imperial core. Even when the colonies prospered, the profit flowed east across the Atlantic. But the most destabilizing British policy was not taxation. It was monetary control. Most Americans today have never heard of the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, but those laws crippled the colonial economy. By outlawing the colonies' ability to print their own paper money, Britain effectively removed the lubricant that kept the colonial economy moving. With no local currency, credit evaporated, debts soared, businesses collapsed, and ordinary people found themselves unable to buy or sell because the money simply wasn't there. That wasn't a metaphor. There literally was not enough currency in circulation for commerce to function. A modern economist would call it deflation, a shrinking money supply strangling economic life. To the colonists, it felt like suffocation. Imagine running a business in a growing economy where the one thing you need most, money, has been deliberately restricted by an authority thousands of miles away. That was the financial reality of colonial America. And while small farmers and tradesmen struggled, wealthy planters faced a different kind of crisis. Men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owed enormous debts to British merchants, debts denominated in pounds sterling, a currency they were legally forbidden to print or control. Every dip in tobacco prices, every tightening of credit, every British policy that restricted money pushed them closer to financial ruin. Independence didn't just offer liberty, it offered liquidity. A political break could become a balance sheet reset. This doesn't diminish their ideals. It reveals their incentives. The revolution began as a political dispute, but the fuel that spread the fire was economic. When Britain taxed the colonies, they protested. When Britain tightened regulation, they resisted. But when Britain restricted the very currency they needed to survive, the system cracked. A financially starved population becomes an angry population, and an angry population is fertile ground for revolution. But even as tempers rose and protests spread, the colonists faced a brutal truth. Revolutions cost money. Armies cost money. Supplies cost money. And the Continental Congress had none. Absolutely none. This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into textbooks. The United States did not win independence because it was wealthy, prepared, or militarily superior. It won because foreign powers, nations with their own agendas, saw an opportunity to weaken the British Empire without engaging in open war. France was the first. Long before it officially declared support, France secretly funneled money, weapons, and supplies through a fake commercial company called Rodrigue Hortalez and Company, a corporate smokescreen designed to mask the true purpose of its shipments. Behind the scheme was Pierre Beaumarchais, a playwright-turned-financial operative who smuggled gunpowder, rifles, clothing, and hard currency to the American rebels under the guise of ordinary trade. France wasn't supporting democracy. It was striking at Britain's exposed flank. Spain followed, but stealthily. Unable to openly support a rebellion against another monarchy, Spanish officials funneled silver through Havana. That money, coordinated by merchants like the Gardoqui family, made its way into the Continental Army's hands. Spain didn't admire American ideals. It wanted revenge, influence, and control over strategic territories. Then came the Dutch. At the time, Amsterdam was the financial capital of the world, a place where war, trade, and credit intersected. Dutch bankers saw the American rebellion not as a revolution, but as a high-risk investment. Houses like Hope and Company and Van Staphorst purchased American bonds, extended credit, and gave the colonies their first foothold in global finance. Their motive wasn't liberty, it was profit. To them, America was an emerging market with enormous upside. But foreign financiers weren't the only players. Inside the colonies, a handful of individuals became the hidden lifeline of the revolution. Silas Deane, operating in the shadows of Europe, secured French arms before independence was even declared. Robert Morris, a Philadelphia merchant with enormous wealth and influence, became the financial engine of the war effort, using his own credit and connections to procure supplies, organize shipments, and stabilize collapsing markets. And Haym Salomon, perhaps the least recognized yet most influential, used his multilingual networks and financial expertise to convert foreign loans, extend credit, and keep Washington's troops paid and supplied during the bleakest stretches of the conflict. Generals won battles, but these men kept the war alive. As foreign capital flowed into the colonies, the revolution transformed from a desperate uprising into a viable geopolitical project. But loans always come with strings. The colonies weren't receiving charity, they were accruing obligations. France, Spain, and the Dutch weren't gambling blindly. They expected political leverage, economic concessions, and strategic advantage in a world where Britain could be weakened and reshaped. Meanwhile, inside the colonies, Congress issued paper money, the Continentals, which rapidly collapsed in value as inflation surged. The currency became practically worthless, soldiers went unpaid, civilians distrusted paper, and a speculative class emerged, buying government bonds for fractions of their face value. They were betting that one day, the new nation would redeem them at full value. Those who made that bet became some of the earliest financiers, forming the backbone of American high finance. The revolution didn't just create a country, it created a creditor class. Winning the war was only the beginning. The United States emerged victorious but financially shattered. Foreign loans were enormous, domestic debt was chaotic, and the national currency system had basically disintegrated. Independence brought freedom but also obligations to France, to Spain, to the Dutch, and to the private financiers who kept the army alive. The young nation couldn't craft foreign policy purely from principle. Its diplomacy was restricted by the ledger. France expected favorable trade deals. Spain demanded influence over Western expansion and navigation rights on the Mississippi. Dutch bankers insisted on fiscal reforms to safeguard their investments. America entered the world not as a free agent, but as a debtor negotiating from weakness. These pressures shaped the architecture of the new government. The famous rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton was more than philosophical. It was financial. Jefferson envisioned a decentralized agrarian republic. Hamilton understood something Jefferson did not. Creditors do not trust decentralization. No foreign banker would lend money to a loose confederation of states with no unified taxation, no national bank, and no binding authority. To stabilize America's reputation and secure future credit, Hamilton pushed for the assumption of state debts, a national bank, federal taxation, and a strong central government. The United States didn't adopt Hamilton's system because it sounded elegant. It adopted it because the global financial system demanded it. Debt didn't just shape America's policy, it shaped America's identity. Domestically, repayment came at a cost. To service its obligations, the federal government imposed taxes, real, enforceable taxes, and when frontier farmers rebelled against a levy on distilled spirits, America found itself replaying a familiar irony. The nation that had fought against taxation found itself sending troops to suppress its own citizens over taxation. Independence had changed the geography of power, not the mechanics of finance. And even in foreign affairs, debt dictated behavior. When France, now embroiled in its own war with Britain, demanded American military support, the United States refused, not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. The country was too indebted, too fragile, too dependent on British trade revenue and Dutch credit to join a European conflict. Financial vulnerability forced neutrality. And this reveals something essential. The American Revolution didn't end in 1783. It morphed. It evolved from a military conflict into a financial negotiation that shaped the banking system, tax structure, foreign policy, and political ideology of the United States for generations. The ideals of liberty mattered. They mattered deeply. But beneath them was an economic truth. Foreign empires paid for America's experiment. Britain's rivals financed the gamble. America's founders led the revolt, but Europe underwrote it. And here is where history echoes into the present. The United States, today a global superpower accustomed to influencing other nations, was itself born as a proxy project funded by foreign capital. The mechanics of power haven't changed. Nations still finance conflicts to weaken rivals. They still arm rebels, support insurgencies, and channel money through intermediaries. They justify their actions with noble language while pursuing strategic advantage. France did it to Britain in 1776. Modern powers do it across continents today. The technology has changed. The geopolitics have evolved. But the logic remains the same. And that is the deeper lesson. Nations do not rise on ideals alone. They rise when financial incentives align, when creditors support their ambitions, when rivalries create opportunities, and when economic pressure undermines the old order. America's revolution wasn't just a rebellion against empire. It was a reconfiguration of global finance. The colonies succeeded not because they were destined to win, but because they understood, consciously or not, how to turn foreign rivalry into fuel. America wasn't simply declared into existence. It was funded into existence. And if this gives you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.